another installment of AP Euro KO Style. Just a reminder that this presentation coincides with my student's textbook, which happens to be Western Civilization by none other than Jackson J. Spielvogel. Hopefully this presentation helps you comprehend and synthesize the material that is in the text, as well as supplemental material that your teacher utilizes for your instruction. Remember, there are many ways to skin a cat. I'm not really sure I care to skin a cat, but the expression definitely works here. As you can see here with this slide, there are numerous thematic learning objectives covered within the context of this particular presentation and this particular chapter. So it's very important for you to kind of pay attention. I'm not going to read them all to you. However, these are the thematic learning objectives that are in your textbook and that you are responsible for. So let's focus. In this lesson, in this episode, we're going to focus on the causes and the results of the American Revolution, and really what impact that American Revolution had on Europe, because many people say that it had a cause and a direct impact on what happened in France in 1789. So, we get to the causes of the American Revolution. We have to dig back into the wars of the 18th century. If you remember, the 18th century, despite sometimes being referred to as the Age of Enlightenment, the 18th century also saw some nasty continental wars which spilled over into global conflicts as the mercantilistic nations that we've learned about stepped on each other's toes all over the globe. And if you remember the War of Austrian Succession, Frederick II challenged the legitimacy of the Pragmatic Sanction and the rule of Empress Maria Theresa from Austria. This spilled over into a continental conflict where the status quo eventually was restored, minus the fact that Prussia and Frederick kept Silesia. So then what happened? Well, if you remember in Chapter 18, there was a diplomatic revolution. And this diplomatic revolution, basically, a new system of alliances were formed to create a new balance of power. And this new balance of power consisted of longtime rival Austria and France finding themselves friends, solidified by the marriage of Austrian Princess Marie Antoinette to France's heir to the throne, Louis XVI. So war, after that diplomatic revolution and that balance of power, was only avoided really for about 6 years, because by 1754, bullets fly between the British colonial colonel, I might add, George Washington, in present-day Pennsylvania, with the French over who controls the Ohio River Valley around the present-day Pittsburgh region. This war, if you remember, is what many historians refer to as the First World War, as it was fought in the continent of Europe, North America, on the high seas, and in India. Well, as previously covered, despite a horrific start to this war, England, under the leadership of Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder, outspends thanks to their Bank of England, which enables them to borrow large sums of money and to basically outspend and therefore outperform France. Again, a topic also covered extensively in Chapter 18 of Spielvogel. And in the end, Britain was victorious, of course, and France lost most of its North American possessions, including Canada, as well as it was unable to maintain its dominance over lucrative India. So what was the problem here? Why and how was this a cause of the American Revolution? Well, remember, Britain outspent and outborrowed France. And newsflash, it's necessary when you borrow money, you have to pay it back. You got to pay back your debts. So after the 7 Years' War, Britain sought to raise revenue from the 13 American colonies to pay for the expenses the British Army had incurred while defending the colonists in North America. Remember, militarily, many of the British battles in the 7 Years' War were in fact in North America, not on continental Europe. That's where Frederick the Great did most of his work, while the British just pumped money towards his cause to the Prussians to wage his war. The British fought in North America, in Pennsylvania, and up through Canada mainly. So the British decided that this was time they needed to levy new taxes on the colonists for them to, quote-unquote, pay for their part in this effort. The problem, many American colonists had felt they had done their part. Many American colonists aided and actually fought alongside British troops in the defense of North America. George Washington, Light Horse Henry Lee, to give you a few examples. And, many American colonists didn't initially see themselves as any different from your average Brit that lived over in England. They considered themselves Brits. The Brits didn't share the same mutual sentiment. Another problem. The colonists had enjoyed a period of salutary neglect since Robert Walpole was the Prime Minister. During this era of what they call salutary neglect, the mercantilistic navigation acts had been virtually ignored, and many colonists had enjoyed free trade with many nations, which technically was illegal, and they were smuggling, according to the theory of economic mercantilism. Many colonists, including the likes of John Hancock, had made a fortune doing this. Now the British were telling them they couldn't do that. That was a problem. So the British tried first with a proclamation line in 1763 to further prevent tension between the colonists and the natives. The Brits thought, hey, this is a great idea. We'll keep our country out of expensive future wars, but however, the colonists saw this as them preventing their quote-unquote manifest destiny and their future economic progress. There was a lot of frontier out there. They wanted to go explore. Then there was the tax on sugar, which the colonists protested, and what did the British do? They repealed it. Then there was a stamp tax in 1765, and the American colonists freak out, and the British repealed it. So, okay, do you see a pattern here? Every time the Brits legislate or levy a new tax, the colonists seem to freak out. So the Brits can't figure this out. They try to implement new forms of taxation. The colonists continue to complain. They riot. They throw stuff into Boston Harbor. And again, the Brits continue to relent. Each time, the colonists become bolder and bolder. So you could debate, you can actually probably argue that the British probably should have just stuck to their guns, and they probably could have avoided a pretty embarrassing problem they're about to have here with the American Revolution. The other thing I want to make sure that you understand is they couldn't figure out why the Americans were freaking out. In fact, from their perspective, the Americans, they were actually taxed the least of all of the colonial possessions in the British Empire. So, as we get to the causes of the American Revolution, the book says that one of the biggest divides here is that Americans and the British had different views of the British Empire and basically the colonists' place in it. The British philosophy of their empire was a single empire. They were a single empire with a parliament back home in England, as they were the supreme, omniscient authority, or all-knowing, all-powerful rulers of the entire empire. In other words, England was sweet, and their parliament had power over the entire realm. Like it or not, we are Brits, we are better than you, deal with it. Our navy is the best in the world, and we will kill you. Then there's, of course, the American view. You see, since 1619, which marked the founding of a colonial assembly or the House of Burgesses in Virginia, American colonists had enjoyed not only economic salutary neglect that I mentioned earlier, but they also had gotten used to their own local representative assemblies to help manage their own political and economic affairs. And for the most part, each colony had experienced its own form of self-autonomy. They believed in this system and felt that who better knew how to take care of them and their own needs but, well, them. And as I said, during this era of salutary neglect, this was no big deal. But after the 7 Years' War and the debt that it had accumulated, Britain decided to reverse this trend and reverse this relationship and let the American colonists know that they were England, they were sweet, and the American colonists were in fact subjects to the crown. Well, the two sides couldn't come to terms, so on July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress declared independence, thanks to the writing of Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Ben Franklin. It really was a stern political document that confirmed American beliefs in the theories of what we covered in Chapter 17, the Enlightenment. It discussed the natural rights of John Locke, that among these were life, liberty, and property. Pursuit of happiness. Because remember, they're in fact our slaves. So now we move on to the War of Independence. A-push students, oh snap, I forgot. This is Euro. We don't need to know about all the wars on the test, and especially American wars. So what do you need to know? Well, you kind of need to know that George Washington was the man. America killed it and annihilated the Brits. Right? Wrong. Sorry. The American Revolution was in fact like Britain's Vietnam. They kicked the crap out of us mostly. However, we stayed in the fight long enough to get the French involved. And as the war dragged on, the war became very, very unpopular back in England. Again, just like Vietnam in the 1960s and the 1970s in the U.S. mode of history. Public sentiment changed in England, and eventually, once France got involved, England decided they should probably quit and come back a little bit later in 1812. So, the French came through with the much-needed funds for the American colonists. They provided men who served as officers and soldiers in the Washington's army and a much-needed naval assistance to entrap British General Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown in 1781. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, recognized the independence of the American colonies, and granted the Americans the Western Territory from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. So it got rid of essentially that proclamation line of 1763 that the American colonists were so upset about. So, in essence, America became America. Independence from England, and that's all she wrote, right? Wrong. They needed to start a new form of government, one that was in harmony with the Declaration of Independence thing that we reaped of the Enlightenment philosophy. Turns out, this was a lot tougher than anticipated. The colonists were not about to trade one tyrant for a new one. In other words, they didn't like George III and how Parliament had treated them prior. So they were very overly cautious as they formed their new government on how in fact this was going to be set up. So they created the Articles of Confederation in 1781. And the central government of the United States was purposely created with very little power. In fact, under these new articles, the states possessed most of their own individual rights and power, and the federal government was unable really to deal with many of the issues that plagued them early on. It couldn't regulate the economy, as different states had different treaties, had different currencies. It couldn't impose in any way any taxes. It had no way, essentially, to raise revenue or direct a well-planned foreign policy. Fact is that by 1787, 55 delegates went back to Philadelphia to devise a new constitution. They agreed on a constitution with a central government that was separate from and superior over the individual state governments. The new government had the power to tax, raise a military, regulate domestic and foreign trade, creating national currency to facilitate the economy. Montesquieu's theories were alive and well in this document, as the Fed was divided into three branches: the judicial, the legislative, and the executive, each with checks and balances over the other two. The document barely passed, and in most cases only passed because of the promise to offer a Bill of Rights. This was a must for many of the people who still feared a mighty central government with too much power. So the Bill of Rights was passed in 1789. They guaranteed we the people freedom of religion, speech, press, petition, and assembly, the right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches and arrests, a trial by jury, due process of law, and protection of private property. Where did this idea come from? England, after the Stuarts and the Glorious Revolution, sillies. And let's not forget the Enlightenment philosophers and the philosophies that spewed out of Europe earlier in this 18th century. So 1789 was a meteoric year in the annals of Western civilization. The U.S. began its new era in a republican form of government that still exists, and the French decided to take their first attempt at a new government. Were they related? You betcha. The American Revolution impacted the French in many ways. People read books, newspaper articles, and magazines covering the curious events over in North America. Children of the Enlightenment were filled with optimism. Just think, they thought, if this experiment across the Atlantic Ocean could succeed, it would mean that all of this stuff about natural rights, equality, separation of powers, and freedom of religion, etc., could actually work. Much of the information about the affairs in America was brought back by hundreds of literate and influential French soldiers who had fought alongside Americans in their colonial efforts for independence. They were a key conduit in spreading the ideals and hope of the political and moral possibilities back in France. People like Marquis de Lafayette. To many in France, the American Revolution and the Constitution was proof that the ideas of the Enlightenment could be realized politically. Again, this is in harmony with Key Concept 2.14 of the new AP curriculum framework, which reads, "The French Revolution posed a fundamental challenge to Europe's political and social order, and you can make an argument that this possibly was fueled by the happenings in North America with the United States." Now, unfortunately for France, the French Revolution will be much more complex, violent, and radical than the American Revolution, much because there was too much existing baggage that the French had to overcome. The American experiment had the benefit, really, of starting from scratch without the excessive historical, economic, and political baggage of the French society and government.